Masechet Ketubot Daf Nun Chet. We're discussing this Mishnah. Let's remind ourselves of the details that a couple has 12 months to get married from the time that they are engaged to be married. And so if he is not ready after 12 months, he nevertheless has to provide sustenance to her, and he can give her terumah. How much, if he's a Kohen and she's a Bat Yisrael, he can pay her that mizonot, that food, with terumah food, even though they're not married yet. And now, how much can he give her from terumah food? The Bitalfon says all of her food, he can be given to her as terumah. Even though she's going to be nida some of the time, she'll have to sell it and buy regular food. But Rabbi Akiva says half and half. And we'll discuss that calculation. Now, it doesn't count for the Yavam. The Yavam does not have to. The Yavam, if the husband dies, then the clock starts again, and the Yavam cannot give her. She cannot eat terumah under the Yavam for the whole 12 months after the husband dies, and so we don't add the time that she's waiting under the husband with the time that she's waiting for the Yavam. And finally, we say that all that was the original ruling, that she eats terumah only that she eats terumah after 1 year of waiting. But Bet Din afterwards said that that even if it's a full year that she's waiting, and now the husband has to provide for her, yes, he'll have to provide for her, but cannot give her terumah, because she cannot have terumah until she is taken into her husband's house. And we will see why, the difference between the earlier ruling and the later ruling. All right, so that was a review, and now we analyze Rabbi Tarfon Omer Notin Lahakol Terumah. Abaye Amar Abaye. Abaye is going to have two qualifications to this ruling. Machloket bebat kohen lekohen. Aval bebat Yisrael lekohen divrei hakol mechsa cholin mechsa terumah. When Rabbi Tarfon says that one can pay the mizonot of his fiancé with all terumah, that was only if she is a bat kohen and marrying a kohen. Well, what's the difference? If she's a Bat Kohen, then she knows already how to deal with terumah. She knows already from growing up in her father's house that whenever she is teme'ah, whenever she's nida, she wants to consume terumah, she won't be allowed to. She'll have to sell that terumah and buy chulin for it. So she knows the system already. And that's why if she is already a Bat Kohen and knows the system and marrying Kohen, then the Kohen can pay her in all terumah and she'll know what to do with it. But if she's a Bat Yisrael, she's not used to handling terumah. She doesn't know when she can and when she can't eat it and what to do with it. When she can't eat it, as she has to sell it. Then everyone agrees, even Rabbi Tarfon would agree with Rabbi Akiva, that he must give her half terumah and half chulin. That's qualification number one. A second one. That this ruling of Rabbi Tarfon, that one can pay his wife with food, all terumah, that's only during the Kiddushin period. If she already waited 1 year, but they're still mikudeshet, and he's not ready to get married, and they didn't do nisuin yet, then he can give her all terumah. But once they are married, then even Rabbi Tarfon would agree that he has to give her half terumah and half cholin. The reason is because getting all terumah is a pain, because it's going to be some days during the month that she's for sure going to be nida, teme'ah, and now she has to take this terumah and sell it. He has to provide for her in a proper way once they're married. And a proper way means in a way that's convenient. So half terumah, she can use it during the half plus month part of the month that she is tehorah, and the cholin she will use all the time that she is teme'ah. And so that makes sense when he's nesuah, and the full responsibility of the ketubah kicks in, that he has to provide for her fully. During the time of erusin, where they're not fully married yet, and it's just that he promised her food because it's after 12 months already. So then he can rely on giving her only teruma, according to the Bitarfon. All right, Abaye said these two things, and even though Abaye is a fourth generation Amora, we have proof that this was already, this interpretation has a confirmation from a Braita. Tanyana mehachi. Rabbi Tarfon omer, notnin la hakol teruma. Rabbi Akiva omer mechasa chulin mechasa teruma. All that just repeats the Mishnah. When is this machloket true? Bebat kohen lekohen. When you have someone who is a bat kohen marrying kohen. Aval bat Yisrael lekohen divrei hakol mechsa cholin umechsa teruma. But if she grew up as a bat Yisrael and marrying a kohen, then even the Bitarfon would agree with Rabbi Akiva that you give half. And when is this machloket true? Barusa. Aval benisua divrei hakol mechsa cholin umechsa teruma. So it's really actually word for word the words of Abaye. Which is always interesting when you ever have a Tanya Mehachi like this. Well, did Abaye have the Braita? If he knew the Braita, why didn't he quote it and say, the Tanir? He doesn't quote it as a Braita, he quotes it as his own words. So did he not have the Braita? Well, how could it be that we happen to have a Braita that's exactly the same words? So this could be a transmission issue. Sometimes a tradition is transmitted word for word, but the attribution may become different. Either it was originally Braita, but someone forgot it was a Braita. Maybe Abaye repeated it as a Braita, but during transmission they thought it was his own words, or the other way around. So one way or another, it seems that this is a common tradition that either was originally a Braita and Abaye repeated it, or originally was Abaye's words and then became so authoritative that it was remembered as a Braita. All right, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer, notnin la shetei yadot shel teruma v'achat shel chulin. The Braita continues, however, with a couple of more opinions. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, not half and half like Rabbi Akiva, but rather 2/3 teruma, 1/3 chulin. This is a benefit for the husband if he's a kohen, because there's always an excess of teruma, because the pool of people that can eat teruma is so much smaller, so we can give her 2/3 and 1/3, and this would make sense according to the usual cycle. If a woman is nida at 10 days out of 30, so during that 10 days that's 1/3 she'll eat chulin, and during the other 2/3 when she is tehora she can eat the teruma. So this is actually an interesting machloket. If it's based on the estimate of how many days a woman is nida, it can give us some idea of, in practice, what was going on back then, and how many days they usually practiced. On the Doraita level, the days of Nida are only 7, and it's a Zava who has to add 7 clean days plus at least 3 days of seeing blood, which would be the at least 10. So even according to this, it sounds like already in those days they were being machmir to treat all Nidot like Zavot, which is what we do today. If it was only Nida, then maybe it would be only a quarter of a month, and he could say 3/4 teruma, but 1/4 chulin. So this may be proof that already in the times of the Tanaim, women were commonly nida for temeot for more than a week, perhaps following the zava chumrah. Another possibility is what Khatam Sofer says, that even if you say that they followed only the Doraita law of 7 days of Nida, she also would be Teme'ah for other reasons, like once a week at least is the time of Onah, she would become Teme'ah as from Keri. And therefore you have to add those 3 days, if it was Friday night, to the sevens, which would be 10 days altogether. So there are lots of reasons why someone become tameh. There's and all kinds of reasons why she might become tameh. She touched a mouse. Also, she wouldn't be able a dead mouse. She wouldn't be able to eat teruma. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ten lahakol teruma vehi mocheret velokachat bedamim cholin. Rabbi Yehuda says that he can pay her all in teruma. This sounds just like Rabbi Tarfon. So what's the difference between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Yehuda? Maybe it's encoded in the next part, which is she will have to sell the teruma and buy with that money chulin. So Rashi reads into this that Yehuda is saying he has to give her a little extra teruma. Let's say he has to give her, $100 worth of food. So fine, that would be $100 worth of chulin. But if he pays her in teruma, he has to add 10% or whatever it is, because the price for teruma is lower, and so she'll have to sell the teruma for a lower price and buy chulin at a higher price. So he has to give her more teruma to make up the difference. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel seems to be following up on Rabbi Yehuda and saying not just an extra 10 or 20%, whatever would be that market value, but rather whenever it says he can pay teruma, he has to give her double the amount of teruma than he would give of chulin. If it's 1 pound of chulin that he should give her, then it has to be 2 pounds of teruma. And that would make it a lot more easy for the woman to exchange if she has double the amount of teruma, but we want to refrain from making her go through all the trouble. So my benai, what is the difference between those last two opinions? It's the amount of effort. According to Rabbi Yehuda, he just gives her the equivalent of the market price, which means she might have to do some work to go and find kohanim who can buy the teruma. With enough work, she'll be able to buy the same amount of chulin. According to Rashbag, we don't want her to put any effort into it at all. If she's selling twice the amount of teruma, then people will be coming and knocking on her door saying, hey, couldn't we exchange? And that will make it very easy for her. All right. The next part of the Mishnah said that the Yavam does not enable a woman to eat teruma. Mai ta'ama, why? Kinyan kaspo amarachamana v'hai kinyan de'achiv hu. Because the Torah says that a Kohen can issue teruma to anyone who is an acquisition of his money, which means slaves, and his wife, after you do kiddushin, so he acquires her with money in some sense. So that's true for a wife. After kiddushin, then that is applicable. It's in his house. She is in his household under his authority. But a yavam never does kinyan, never does kiddushin. It's just by his brother, the fact of his brother dying, she falls to him. So she is not his acquisition, and therefore, according to this reasoning, even after 12 months, it doesn't matter. The yavam would never be able to feed his wife, his Yishomeret Yavam teruma, until they're fully married. Asta shisha chodashim bifnei haba'al. Now, next part says, if she waited for 6 months before, while her husband, from the time that they got engaged, so 6 months is less than a year, so she does not give her teruma. Now, and then it says also 6 months for yavam. Now, hashta b'fnei abal amat lo b'fnei yavam ibaya. Now, you told me that 6 months, if she is engaged to her husband for 6 months, then he does not give her teruma. Well, then if I know that, then all the more so yavam, because yavam doesn't even have an ability to feed his wife teruma until they're married. So why would you even have to tell me that? Answer is zo tzarich lomar zo katane. You're right, it wouldn't be necessary, but that's one of the structures of the Mishnah. Sometimes it mentions something, and then it mentions something that's even more obvious. I don't have to tell you, of course, the second case. Zo Mishnah Rishona. All right, so now we learned that there were two stages in the development of the law. The earlier stage is that after 12 months of waiting, she can demand that now you have to feed me, and at that point, he can give her teruma. Whereas the later ruling said, no teruma, not even after 12 months until they're married. So let's see why. My ta'ama. Amar ula v'itema Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda mishum simpon. Yesterday we saw these two names, Ula and Rav Shemuel bar Yehuda, in the context of what is the reason for the first ruling. We saw on a deoraita level, kinyan kaspo, she should be able to have teruma already from the time of kiddushin. So why wait at all? And so there, Ula said the reason is because she's still in her father's home and she may share food with her family. Whereas Rav Shemuel Bar Yehuda said the reason is because there's a blemish, mishum simpon. So on the previous stuff, these were the words of Rav Shemuel Bar Yehuda, who said because of simpon. But now we're asking a different question. Simpon means that she may have a blemish, and if he feeds her teruma before the nisuin, and on the night of nisuin he finds a blemish and says, I want to retroactively undo the whole thing, so it'll turn out that she ate that teruma not as kinyan kaspo, because the kiddushin is nullified. So that was the reasoning for why you can't eat teruma right away after the kiddushin. Now we're asking, how about the second part, in which the Bet Din said even after a year, you still no teruma until they're actually married. So Ula, or some say, Rav Shemuel Bar Yehuda say because of simpon. All right, so now let's analyze which one of these authors makes sense. Bishlama le'ula, if it's Ula that said this second reason, then it all makes sense. Kamaita shema yimzigula kos be'tabia, ubatraita mishum simpon. Ula can explain all the stages. The original deoraita stages at Kiddushin, she can eat teruma. Then the rabbis made one decree and said, no, not at that time because she's still in her father's house and she's going to share the teruma. So therefore they said not allowed until 1 year. After 1 year, since he has an obligation to feed her, he's going to do so in a separate house. And so she's not going to share with her family. Fine, that's after 1 year. Now the rabbis came again and made a second takana and said, no teruma until you're actually married. So what's the reason for that? So Ula would agree that there's a secondary reason of simpon, that there may be blemishes and retroactively the whole kiddushin will be annulled. So we can understand all the stages according to Ula. El Rav Shemuel Bar Yehuda kamaita mishum simpon, v'atzamitu mishum simpon. My benayhu, but Rav Shemuel Bar Yehuda explained the first decree because of simpon, and now they're extending it again because of simpon. What's the difference between them? And the answer is ika bena b'dikat chutz. The difference would be doing an external investigation, meaning someone besides the husband, like one of his relatives, maybe his mother or his sister, would check the fiance and see if she has any physical blemishes on her body. So Morris sabah b'dikat chutz shema b'dika, or Morris sabah b'dikat chutz lo shema b'dika. So originally when they made the first decree, they said, listen, don't, as soon as you do, here's the full reconstruction. In the Torah law, once you do kiddushin, she can eat teruma. The rabbis came and say, yeah, but maybe he's going to have a blemish. So she's going to have a blemish and they'll undo it retroactively. So it says, okay, not allowed until 1 year. What happens after 1 year? Well, at that point, even though there's no nisuin yet, he will arrange for his female relative, to check her, and that will be a superficial outside investigation that he does through his relative, and that is a sufficient check. And once you do that, he's not going to retroactively annul the marriage anymore, so she can start eating teruma. But after that, they decided, you know what, that is only an external investigation, that a relative, and they're not going to be as thorough as the husband himself will be at the consummation after the marriage. And so they made a secondary decree that, you know what, we should not allow teruma, not even after the 1 year, until there is full nisuin. The next Mishnah discusses the rights and obligations between the husband and wife. The husband has a basic obligation to provide sustenance to his wife, and in return, he has a right to her earnings. That's true for the basic amount of her earnings. That would be more or less equivalent to the sustenance that he has to pay for her. However, if a wife makes much more than the basic earnings, then what happens to that extra money? So that also goes to the husband in exchange for him giving her an allowance of a ma'ah each week. So there's two levels of what he has to give her and what he has a right to take from her as equivalent. Okay, so now the Mishnah is going to talk about a case where Hamakdish Maseh Yedei Ishto. A husband says that my wife's earnings will be consecrated to the Bet HaMikdash. They will be holy. Does that work or not? The answer is it does not work. She can continue working and she can eat, meaning sustain herself from her own work, meaning that these earnings do not belong to the husband. They remain the wife's, and a person does not have a right to consecrate something that does not belong to him. That's why the consecration doesn't work. The Gemara is going to talk about what kind of case are we talking about. Is it a case where he is sustaining her and therefore he gets her earnings? Well, then he should have a right to make it consecrated. So rather, it sounds like it must be talking about a case where she keeps her own earnings and does not sustain and sustains herself. Okay, but that we'll discuss. Now, hamotad, the added amount, the surplus of what she gets above and beyond what she would need for her sustenance. What about if the husband consecrates that part, or if he consecrates all of it? Does the surplus also does the surplus get consecrated or not? Rabbi Meir omer hekdesh, Rabbi Yochanan Asandad omer cholin. Rabbi says yes, and that in fact does get consecrated, which is interesting that the base amount does not, but the added amount does get consecrated. And so why does the husband have a right to the surplus? We'll see, the Gemara will talk about that. And according to one interpretation, it only means after her death, when he inherits it, then it becomes consecrated, but he won't have a right to it at that point. And Rabbi Yochanan also would also say, Chulin, he does not have a right to the added amount, but the surplus, that's hers. And so therefore it is not consecrated. Okay, more discussion on that. Now, the Gemara introduces a law. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav Yechola Isha Lomar Leba'ala Eni Nizonet Ve'eni Osa. Although there's a basic obligation for the husband to sustain his wife, wife can say, listen, I don't want your food, and you will not get the earnings that I work for. Right? I make enough money, and I don't want your food, and I don't want you to take my money. So a wife has a right to make that deal that is permissible. Now, Kasabar, how come Rav thinks that this can be done? The reason is because what comes first, the obligation for earnings, or the obligation of sustenance, or the right to take earnings? He must think that the rabbis primarily made the obligation that the man has to feed his wife. That's the number one thing. And then, in consequence, they said, listen, if the husband has to feed his wife and she gets to keep her own earnings, that will lead to eva, to animosity. He's going to say, look, she makes money, she keeps all the money, and I have to pay for her food, and he'll be upset about it. So therefore, the rabbi said, since we are obligating the husband to feed his wife, therefore, as a consequence, we will allow him to keep her earnings. Since that's the basic, the basic requirement is sustenance. Therefore, if she says, I don't want what I have a right to, the rabbi said you have to feed me, you keep it, I don't care about it. And so since he's not providing for her, then the secondary obligation falls away as well. If it was the other way around, if the primary obligation was that the husband has a right to her earnings, and then as a consequence they say, listen, you're getting her earnings, I think you should feed her. If that was the case, then she would not have a right to say no, that you can't get my earnings, because that would be a basic law. So we see that according to Rav Huna in the name of Rav, the basic requirement is for feeding, and that's why she can refuse it. All right, now we have going to bring a couple of challenges to this statement of Rav. One challenge and then a proof. We have a baraita that says the rabbis instituted food in place of her earnings, which sounds like her earnings are the basic requirement, and then they said, well, since you're getting her earnings, then you also should feed her. So that's against what we just said. So we amend the Braita. Ema tiknu ma'aseyadeha tachat mezonot. Say instead that the rabbis instituted that the husband gets his wife's earnings, and because he has to pay her for her food. So the basic requirement is he has to pay for her food, and therefore, in consequence, he should get her earnings, and that's why she can reject it. Okay, so we solved that problem. Now we're going to bring a possible proof from our Mishnah. That's why Rav's statement is here in the first place. Lema misaya le hamakdish masaya de ishto harehi osa ve'ochelet. My love benizonet. Mishnah said that if a man consecrates the earnings of his wife, she gets to keep them and eat from her own earnings. Aren't we talking about a case where she is sustained? Now, it looks like this means sustained by her husband, but actually it has to mean the opposite. It means that the husband can sustain her, is willing to, but she refuses and says, I want to feed myself and I want to keep my own money. Since it's talking about such a case, that's why the husband has no rights to her earnings, and that's why if the husband tries to consecrate them, they don't work. So, therefore, this seems to be a proof to support the law of Rav Huna in the name of Rav. And we say not necessarily law b'she'ena nizonet. Maybe it's talking about a case where the husband not only does not, but cannot feed his wife. He doesn't have sufficient funds for it. And that's the reason why she keeps it. But it's only because he is not feeding her, because he is not capable of giving her food, and that's why she keeps her earnings. But if he had the ability to feed her and wants to, then she would not have a right to opt out. So there's not necessarily a proof from here. And then we ask about that. If you're really talking about a case where he does not have funds to feed her, and then therefore she keeps her earnings, isn't that obvious? Would anyone possibly think that a man can not feed his wife because he can't, or he refuses, and still he would get her earnings? That would be impossible. As follows: let's compare this to a case of a slave. Even according to the opinion that says that a master can tell his slave, you work for me and I'm not feeding you. You have to do all the work. I keep your earnings and you have to find your own food. That's a machloket, whether a master can say that. But that opinion would only apply to Eved Kana'ani, deloketi be'imach, where it doesn't say that it's good for him with you. Aval Eved Ivri dichti be'imach, but regarding Eved Ivri, where it does say it's good for him with you, talking about a case where the Eved Ivri is happy with his master and he wants to stay longer. So we learn from there that one has to feed his Eved Ivri. According to one opinion, he has to feed also an Eved Kana'ani. So So regarding Eved Ivri, one cannot say, I'm going to keep your earnings and you have to find your own food. Kol sheken ishto. So all the more so with one's wife, it would be impossible for anyone to think that a man could get away with not feeding his wife and keep her earnings. So therefore we say, what would be the point of this Mishnah? It would be obvious. And the answer is, we need it for the last clause. You're right, the first clause is obvious, that if he's not sustaining his wife because he can't afford it, then obviously he doesn't have a right over her earnings, and so therefore if he tries to consecrate it wouldn't work. That part is obvious. But the rest of it, we need motad regarding any excess surplus that she makes. Rabbi Meir omer hekdesh, Rabbi Yochanan asandad omer chulin. So teach us the law of Rabbi Meir that even in that case, where he's not sustaining her, nevertheless, could be he has a right over her surplus, and that's why when he consecrates her earnings, the surplus does become hekdesh. Okay, we're going to come back to that Rabbi Meir's opinion. But right now we want to note that Peliga de Resh Lakish, Rav Huna's law that she can opt out, goes against the opinion of Resh Lakish. Damar Resh Lakish lo tema ta'ama de Rabbi Meir mishum tekasabar adam makdish davar shelo ba'ala olam. If you read the Mishnah, you might think that how come Rabbi Meir says that when a husband says your earnings are consecrated, the surplus becomes hekdesh. You might derive from this that according to Rabbi Meir, one can consecrate something that doesn't exist in the world? This is a general question. Can you make an acquisition, do a transaction with something that doesn't yet exist, that will only exist in the future? There's like future options. And so it might seem that, well, her earnings, if he consecrates her future earnings, they don't exist yet. So you might think that we can conclude from here that one can consecrate something that doesn't exist in the world. Resh Lakish says, no, don't think that. That's not the best explanation for this Mishnah. Rather, Rabbi Meir is reasoning is because a man can force his wife to give over to him her earnings, so too he can say to her, it's as if he's saying, your hands themselves are consecrated. Not the physical hands, but anything that the hands will do, anything that they will make, all of her work are already consecrated. So therefore, we can explain it not that it's something that didn't come into the world yet. It's true, the earnings have not come into the world yet, but her potential earning power, that's what it means, her hands. Her hands, that whatever they do are consecrated, so that is something that does exist in the world. We see from this statement of Resh Lakish that a man can force his wife to give over her earnings, and she cannot opt out. Okay, so that's the opposite of Rav Huna's opinion that she can opt out. We ask about that. But that's not what he said. He said, in the language of the Mishnah, he said, your earnings are consecrated. He didn't say your hands are consecrated. So why should it possibly work? Oh, this is because we have another statement of Rabbi Meir, who says in general, a person does not say words for naught. If a person says something and they don't make any legal sense, then we advocate for him and say he must have meant something else, and we'll kind of fix it up for him so that it does make legal sense. So therefore, nasa keomer la yikadeshu yadayich lo sehem. When a person says that my wife's earnings will be consecrated, since these are future earnings, and that does not make a legal sense because you cannot sanctify something that is not in the world, we will interpret it as if he said, your hands are now consecrated, and thereby all the future earnings will be consecrated. Okay, so that explains that point. Okay, now that discussion of Rabbi Resh Lakish was dependent on the idea that Rabbi Meir does not think you can consecrate something that doesn't exist. But that itself is not true. Is it true Rabbi Meir thinks that you cannot consecrate something that's not in the world? The following Braita teaches otherwise. Here we're talking about not makdish as in consecrating, but rather as a language of mikudeshet, of doing kiddushin. If a man says, you will be mikudeshet to me after I convert, he's not Jewish, and so as a non-Jew he cannot do kiddushin, but he's going to do it from now, and say, once I convert, here, take this money, and eventually will be kiddushin. Does that work? So it doesn't exist in the world yet. He doesn't exist in the world yet as a Jew. Can he do a kiddushin for the future? Or if she's not Jewish, and again, that would not work. If a Jewish man gives money to a non-Jewish woman and says, there is no kiddushin. But if he says, for the future, does that work? Or the same thing if either he or her are an Eved Kenani or Shifcha Kenanit, which is equivalent to a non-Jew, and says, after I am freed, in which then he would become a full Jew, or after you are free, in which case she would be a full Jew. Same thing. If a man goes to a married woman and says, Haret mikudeshet li, with this money, after your husband dies. Right now, it's impossible to do kiddushin because she's married, but he wants to jump the gun, and so as soon as her husband dies, this kiddushin will work. This is something that also does not yet exist in the world. She does not exist as a marriageable woman at this point. Or if a man is married to one sister and he goes to the other sister he's not married to and he's not permitted to marry at this point, and he says, here is your kiddushin, when your sister dies, when the one he's married to dies, then she will become available and marriageable to him. He wants to do kiddushin from now for a situation that doesn't yet exist. Or if a woman is a shomeret yavam attached to a yavama, so yavama. Woman is shomet yavam attached to a yavam, so she cannot marry someone else. If a man goes to her and says, "Here is your kiddushin for when the yavam does chalitza," she's not available to marry now, but she will be available. So all these are doing kiddushin with a person or in a situation that doesn't yet exist. Is it valid? Rabbi Meir Omer Mekudeshet. Rabbi Meir says in all these cases, yes, it works. So therefore, you can do kiddushin for a future situation. So too, Rabbi Meir would say that you can consecrate something that doesn't yet exist. So in fact, he does think that. So therefore, he could explain Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah also to mean that the kiddushin works because it's something that doesn't yet exist in the world. You don't have to say anything about her hands and say that he can force her hands. And so he will explain Resh Lakish's proof. Rabbi Meir meant to say that yes, from that baraita, I can prove that Rabbi Meir does think that you can consecrate something from the future. But what he meant is that from this law in our Mishnah, one cannot infer it. It's true that Rabbi Meir happens to think you can consecrate things in the future, but that is not actually the main reason for what is in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is explained by Resh Lakish because he can force her to give up her earnings, which means that according to Resh Lakish, the basic law requirement is that he has a right to earnings. Since he has a right to earnings, therefore he has to feed her. But since that's the basic obligation, she cannot get out of it. The opposite of Rav Huna in the name of Rav. All right, now we're going to further explain Rabbi Meir's opinion. Hamotav regarding the surplus, Rabbi Meir says it is hekdesh. Emat kadosh. According to Rabbi Meir, when does it become kadosh? Rav Ushmuel damre tarvayu motar leachar mita kadosh. That surplus is not consecrated during her lifetime. It's hers. Only after her death, when he inherits it, then since he made it kiddushin before, made it consecrated before, when he acquires it, it becomes sanctified. Ravada bar Hava amar motar mechayim kadosh. However, Ravada bar Hava says no. While she's alive, whenever he says this is consecrated, it becomes consecrated at that point, according to the Rabbi Meir. Okay. Have bar Papa. Now, Papa analyzed these two interpretations. B'mai, and says, what case are they talking about? If it's talking about a husband who is doing everything he's supposed to, and he's feeding her, and he also gives her the weekly allowance, what is the reason for Rav and Shemuel, who says it's not consecrated during her lifetime, but only after her death? Since he is providing for her both the food and he is providing the allowance, so then her surplus should go to him. Since he gets her surplus, he should be able to consecrate it at any time. So it can't be that's talking about that case. Otherwise, we couldn't explain Rav and Shemuel. If it's talking about a case where the husband is not providing her food and also not providing the weekly allowance, in that case, since he's not providing for her, she keeps all of her money, the base amount and the surplus. So according to that, what would be the reason of Rav Ada, who says that it is consecrated, that he does have access to it? He should not have access to it at all. So either way, it's hard to find a case where we can, a case that would be subject to a machloket. Both of these cases are clear cut. So we answer, rather, we're talking about a case where he does feed her, but he doesn't give her a weekly allowance. Therefore, Rav Ushmuel sabre tiknu mezonot tachat maseyada u'ma chesef tachat motar. Rav and Shmuel say, as I explained in the beginning of the shiur today, that food is an exchange for the base earnings, and his right to take and his responsibility to give her an allowance is in exchange for her surplus. Surplus earnings. Okay, so and since we're talking about a case where he is not providing an allowance, so he is providing food, but no allowance, so therefore the surplus she gets to keep. So when he tries to consecrate the surplus, that does not work during her lifetime, but rather only afterwards. So that explains Rav and Shemuel. Ravada bar Abba sabar tiknu mezonot tachat motar u'ma'a chesef tachat ma'aseh yadeha. Ravada bar Abba changes the exchanges for what they are equivalent to, and says that the rabbi said he has to feed her, and then that's exchange for the surplus of her earnings, whereas the regular allowance that he's supposed to give her is in exchange for her base salary. So you mean the completely opposite. So in this case, because he is providing her with food, and that is equivalent to the surplus. So the surplus he does get, and that's why it is considered consecrated even during her lifetime. All right, now why do they argue about what is in exchange for the other? According to Rav and Shemuel, we look for the things that are most common. Giving food, a daily food, that happens every day, not just once a week, so that's more common. And the base amount of her earnings are more common than the surplus. Not everybody makes more and has surplus more than they need. So the base earnings are the more common. Whereas Rav Ada bar Ahava reasoned that something that is a fixed amount should be equivalent to something that's fixed amount. The weekly allowance is a fixed amount, me'ah, each week. Whereas food, sometimes people eat more, sometimes people eat less. And so therefore that should be the same as the fixed amount, which is her base earnings. There's a base amount of what is considered minimum wage, minimum earnings that she is expected to acquire, and so that's a fixed amount is equivalent to a fixed amount. All right, now first a question to Rav Ada bar Ahava. Braita says that food is in exchange for her base earnings, right? So that follows Rav and Shemuel against Rav Ada. Oh, no, change the understanding of that Braita, that food is in exchange for the surplus of her earnings. All right. And now a challenge to Rav and Shemuel. Tashema. If he does not give, this is from a Mishnah, upcoming Mishnah, if he does not give her the allowance for her needs, then she keeps her earnings. So this looks like it's earnings for allowance. The base earnings are for allowance. That's what Rav Ada says against Rav and Shemuel. So again here, Ema motar ma'aseh yadeha shela. No, read it to understand it to read that it's the surplus of her earnings. That is what's in exchange for the allowance. Okay, hold on. But we said about that in the continuation of the Mishnah. It says, Mahi osalo mishkal hamesh shelaim sheti bihuda. The continuation of the Mishnah clarifies what is the amount that she must earn and to give him. What's the base amount? And it explains it's the weight of 5 selah of thread in Yehuda. So she has to produce the amount of yarn that she must spin is that amount of weight, which in Yehuda. So you see that this is a basic amount. So it's clear that's talking about Maaseh Yadah, base amount. So you can't really just reread it and say it's talking about a surplus. This is not a definition of surplus. And since it's a base amount, this says a base amount is equivalent in exchange for the allowance. And this is, once again, a challenge to Rav and Shemuel. And final clarification, Hachika Amar. Maaseh Yadah kama have, deleda motar dida kama. we were asking how much is the base required amount of our earnings, so that we can calculate how much the surplus is. We have to subtract the base amount, and then we'll know the surplus. And how much is that? Mishkal 5 shelim sheti b'Yehuda she'en 10 shelim beGalil. It's the weight of 5 selah of thread in Yehuda. It's equivalent of 10 selah in the Galilee. There's different measurements, and so we can read that Mishnah as saying that he gives her the allowance in exchange for motad ma'aseh. And then Mishnah continues and says, well, how much is ma'aseh? So that we'll subtract that, and then we'll know how much is the surplus. Baruch Adonai L'olam. Amen ve'amen.